What's up, guys? So we are back again with the podcast, and today, again, we are without Gary. So, we all mourn his loss. He's gone. He's not on the podcast anymore. We're getting rid of him. We're getting much better guests on instead. So that brings us to the topic of today's podcast and the guest on today's podcast, which you've probably seen from the title. We are going to discuss something which surprisingly has a lot of controversy around it, which potentially you wouldn't think it is a controversial thing. And rather than myself and Gary just talking absolute waffle about the concept, we decided to get someone on the podcast that actually knows what they're talking about. So that comes in the form of Shannon. So Shannon, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, telling people who you are, what you do, and your interest in all this stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'm Gary 2.0 for the day. But as you said, my name is Shannon. I am a nutrition coach. What else? I have been living out of a suitcase for like 2.5 years now. So I think that qualifies me as a nomad. And I've also recently been collaborating with Dr. Gabrielle Fundaro around some of the topics that we're going to be touching on today, actually. And we're kind of coming up with a framework for coaching that we've coined comprehensive coaching in order to bridge the gap with some divides that we see in the industry right now. So one of those divides being the kind of gap between health and fitness. Like you don't have to choose between both. We can achieve a change in a healthy way. And what we're kind of working towards is our concept of flourishing health, which is a bit more well-rounded than just simply considering physical health. Like, yes, it's important, but we also want to consider someone's psychological well-being, emotional health, and things like that. And yeah, as you mentioned, there's a lot of kind of mixed opinions on the anti-diet versus the pro-diet groups, and there's a kernel of truth to both sides. So we're just kind of in the messy middle ground trying to be like, look guys, why are we arguing? Like, this doesn't make sense. So we're all here for the same purpose, which is just to make people healthier at the end of the day.
Yeah, so regular listeners to the podcast, if I could speak, will know that, like, obviously this message really does align with what we see the whole health and fitness industry should be, in terms of, it doesn't have to be like health or fitness. It, like, you can take a little bit from every area and be like, that's what I need to focus on for me as an individual, because there is no one size fits all. This is the approach you need to take, right? And moving the conversation towards what we actually want to discuss, I'll actually just give an analogy to start this. So when I always think of these dichotomies you hear in like around any topic, right? Generally, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and that's all fine to say, right? But people oftentimes hear that and then they always just stay in the middle, right? I'm going to give actually two analogies, right? So people end up sitting on the fence for so long that they have splinters in their ass, right? So like that's what they do. They never actually dive deep into one side or the other. They never actually, read more into it. They just kind of go, oh yeah, well, I'm basically like going to stay in the center of these two opinions, right? People hate people who stay in the center, right? And also, second, and I've said it before on the podcast, but like this is more of a political thing, but the concept is the same, right? Like sometimes there are decisions where you have to go like left or right, or you have to choose one side or the other. Like I always use the analogy of, like, if I say that the decision we're going to, or the choice we're making is around, okay, I've just picked up a turd, you have to eat this, right? And one side is saying you have to eat this, and the other side is saying I'm never going to eat this, right? That's a no. And the people that stay in the middle are like, oh, I ate half of this, so it's all good, right? So oftentimes, like, it's still a bad position to be in the middle, right? However, you actually put out information that, while it's in the middle, it's still good information, because you're actually reading into both sides of the argument and taking the best points from both sides, rather than just going like, oh, I'm not actually going to make a choice, or in the analogy I just used, I'm going to eat half the turd, rather than actually being like, oh, this is a good point that these guys made on this side, oh, and this is also a good point that these guys made on this side. So how are we marrying these two things? And maybe you're right about this, but wrong about this, and you're right about this and wrong about this. So I think you guys navigate it quite well, rather than what you see a lot of the time, which is just like, I'm sitting on the fence, or, I'm just going to stay in the center. I'm not actually going to, put forth my ideas around this, or again, like, read the opposition side's arguments, And so with that out of the mind, or with that out of the way, what is the concept of HAES, and then why is there so much controversy around it, right? Because like the concept itself, for me, like I've read a lot of the literature, I've read people's opinions on it, and I'm like, this doesn't seem like a controversial opinion or a thought process. Even I wouldn't even say it's an opinion, like it's just a thought process, right? But I've also read like the hyperbolic, like straw man arguments around it, and I can be like, okay, so I understand that. Like I was saying to you before the podcast, like I would definitely lean further right in like my political ideologies and like the way I think. So certain times I get this like visceral reaction to when I hear certain ideologies or thought processes, and I'm like, okay, like maybe I need to read further into that. But I think people just don't read further into it, and they effectively just straw man someone else's argument based on some random, I don't know, Instagram influencer who doesn't really understand the concepts that they're talking about, or maybe they're just beginning their understanding of the concept. So what is HAES? Why is there controversy around it? And how should, like, I know a lot of coaches and stuff listen to this, like, why should they actually start reading a bit more about this so that they can actually help more people? And obviously, if you're just the lay person listening to this, like, these concepts are actually really beneficial in terms of actually getting results longer term, and understanding how to actually approach nutrition, health, lifestyle, all that kind of stuff. So that was me rambling on. It's your turn.
So health at every size, that's what HAES stands for. It's a paradigm that is kind of born out of it's to do with weight stigma at the end of the day. It's kind of like a social justice movement, and it promotes like there's 5 tenets of health at every size that I'm pretty sure if most people were aware of them, most people would tend to agree. And that's the concept of weight inclusivity, health enhancement, respectful care, eating for well-being, and life-enhancing movement. And I'm like, what part of that sounds problematic? Because to me, I'm like, this is a good idea. What happens, I think it is that a visceral reaction that you mentioned, is that someone will come across an individual who, on social media or whatever, who is taking an extreme stance and associating themselves with the movement, but they're not actually HAES aligned. Like, HAES, health at every size, does not claim that you can be healthy at any size. It's about having the opportunity to engage in health-seeking behaviors no matter where you're starting from. And I think that's really important, because I've worked with a number of clients who feel like they've tried to make a change multiple times and haven't had much success. And when you've got what seems like a long way to go, that's very overwhelming. Whereas if you can adopt the kind of idea that, no matter where I'm starting from, I can go to the gym. I don't have to be fit before I go to the gym. I can start where I am and start making these healthier changes. And it's also a weight neutral approach, but that doesn't mean that it's anti-weight loss, just that the focus isn't on weight loss. Depending on your starting point, if you start increasing your micronutrient intake, you start engaging in that life-enhancing movement, and you find the joy in doing those behaviors, weight loss may occur as a side effect. It just kind of depends on what your habitual routine was prior to doing those behaviors. So the movement itself isn't anti-weight loss. It isn't promoting. I think it also gets associated with like body positivity, in the sense that just love yourself where you are and accept yourself and don't do anything. It's like, no. Like, HAES is actually promoting changing your behaviors, but just doing so in a healthy way. And if you look at the literature, weight neutral approaches are just as efficacious as weight centered approaches. because like kind of neither of them are super effective long term when you look at the stats. But that's to say that when we focus on weight, there are sometimes issues involved in that. For example, if someone's expectations aren't aligned with what we would realistically expect them to achieve in terms of losing a certain amount of weight per week, they can feel like they're a failure because they haven't met their own expectations, even though they've, made some significant changes to their diet. They're exercising more than what they used to, but it's very hard to focus on those things if a goal weight is your primary focus. So from shifting the focus from fat loss and weight to these actual behaviors that you're engaging in, it's a more process oriented approach, and it has a better outcome in terms of like psychological effects as well, because there's not as much pressure and you're focusing on health. And yeah, at the end of the day, I really don't think there's much that's problematic about that when you understand what HAES truly is. I just think it gets associated with the extreme views where you think that we're discounting the health effects of potentially being, well, again, not a certain size. So HAES makes some great points that BMI isn't a great indicator of health. Metabolically healthy obesity does exist. About 35% of people who have a BMI of overweight or obese are metabolically healthy, although they are at risk of developing negative health consequences in the future. So they don't discount that, but it is a good point to bear in mind that appearance, weight, and health, they're not as clear cut as you may think. So I think that's something that we could consider as well when it comes to our typical approach in the fitness industry, which is very body oriented.
Yeah, like I just don't see why there is such an issue with it. Like I do see why there is an issue with it, because again, people align it with like that very like SJW, like social justice warrior, like, and we're just all body positivity, and it's very pushed to one side. But when you actually read what they're actually promoting, it's like this is you're very hard to argue against it, right? Now you might have like a certain thing, like we'll get into it, like intuitive eating, like we'll talk about that in terms of, the name is a bad name, but you might have like some small issues with certain things, but overall as a concept, it's like this gives you a framework to actually help more people, right? Because like I always think of like first of all, guys are really bad for it in terms of going to a doctor when there's an issue. They'll just be like, oh, I'll just wait it out, I just won't go, like I just won't, whatever, but that's also the case with people that are obese or potentially moving towards that obese area, because they feel like if I go to a doctor, I'm just going to be told lose weight, right? And that's like a terrible prescription. But that's also what people in the health and fitness industry do. They're like, oh yeah, look, I know you want to be healthier, so you need to lose weight, right? And that's not like that might be what they actually need, right? Like there are cases where it's like, okay, well, like you genuinely just need to lose weight. That's the thing that is the factor that's going to be between health and unhealth, right? But that's still not a prescription, right? That's still not like how do I lose weight? Like that's not like saying lose weight is not telling me what to engage in, what to do. Like obviously we know like, oh, exercise more and eat less, like that's your prescription, but that's not actually giving me habits that I can engage in. That's not actually giving me a framework to think about like, okay, even if I don't see these massive changes on the scale every single week or day or whatever, and I'm still moving towards a healthier lifestyle because I'm engaging in these other habits, such as eating lean protein or like protein in general at each of my meals, eating some vegetables, fruit, being like, we always try to say like calorie appropriate with the diet, and again that can be, you want to gain weight, lose weight, whatever. But also like I always think it's really weird how people use the HAES like framework, and they only think of people that are on like the higher end of the BMI scale, right? But it also applies to people that are on the lower end or in the middle or wherever. It's like at any stage of like health, size, whatever, you can still engage in healthy habits. And this is why I think like, again, like when people see that like it's weight neutral or it's body inclusive, like it's inclusive of like anyone trying to engage in like healthy practices, they read that and they just automatically think like, oh, this is just for fat people that don't want to lose weight, and they want to pretend like they're it's not an issue, right? And like again, I can understand the visceral reaction. You can be thinking like, oh, that's who, you know, they're trying to promote this, right? And that's not the case. Like this framework or this approach, this thinking process, like it applies to anyone across the spectrum of like body sizes or, you know, whatever. And I just don't understand why people have such an issue with, you know, just trying to engage in healthy practices, because like ultimately that's all you want to engage in. I didn't actually finish that thought there, but if you are a woman and you go to a doctor and all they tell you, like you're like a woman and you feel like you're a bit overweight and you're like, oh, I want to engage in healthier practices, and the doctor is just like, all right, you need to lose weight. Like that's going to stop you going to the doctor in future, you know? And like this is something that people, like, first of all, that are, you know, overweight experience all the time, but also this does seem to be very prevalent in terms of how women like get treated with the healthcare system, or again like the health and fitness system. It's like, oh, like you obviously want to lose weight, you know, when you go to the doctor or whatever, and it's like, this is not like that shouldn't be an approach. You know, that, well, first of all, it isn't an approach. It's just, you know, you need to lose weight. Like that's not telling me how to do anything. So I don't know, again, like I understand why there is a bit of controversy in terms of like when you first are introduced to the concept, you can be like, whoa, like that's, these people, like they seem to be overweight and they're just promoting like, oh, I'm not going to try to lose my weight, or like lose the weight, it's weight neutral and all that. And you're kind of like, oh, like I've always thought that, you know, you have to lose weight to be healthier, you know. But again, that's not what HAES itself is actually, you know, promoting. And I think like if you actually just read the words like of HAES, like health at every size, like that's actually indicative of the movement, rather than what people actually read, which is healthy at every size, right? Which, you know, it's only one letter difference, but it actually does make a huge difference in terms of how you actually interpret the processes. Because again, anyone can engage in healthy behaviors, you know, like health promoting behaviors. Like not everyone can be healthy, you know, like if you are whatever BMI of 30 and you're unhealthy, right? Like even if you do start engaging in these healthy behaviors, like you can still be unhealthy at that size, right? So yes, you are definitely trying to help yourself by, you know, engaging in health practices, but it doesn't, just because you engage in health practices doesn't mean that you are healthy, you know? So I think if people actually just read what the letters mean and actually, you know, read some of the literature, like you'd be like, oh, this is actually, you know, this is pretty good.
But I think the reaction that we've had to the movement, like by the industry, just says a lot about the fitness industry itself, like how far removed we are and how kind of there's a lot of barriers to kind of engaging in these lifestyle changes. And most people, when they think of the fitness industry, they're like, oh, fitness models, shredded, like bodybuilders. That's not what health and fitness is supposed to be about. And I think HAES, as you mentioned, is not actually just for people with overweight or obesity, but I think it speaks to those people well because it kind of understands more about what those people may face, and especially in terms of weight stigma. That's something that a lot of people, a lot of us in the fitness industry, a lot of coaches have never experienced. Like we don't know what it's like to feel kind of judged for being a certain weight or body composition. And as you mentioned, like the advice that people get when it comes to changing isn't helpful because it's not a behavior that they can engage in. Like if you just tell someone just to lose weight, well, yeah, how? That doesn't understand the problem, like why they got to where they are in the first place, and whether they're ready to change certain things. And if we can focus on certain behaviors that someone may feel ready to change and that they can do at any moment, like you don't have to be fit before you can engage in like mindful movement. You don't have to be really healthy before you can start thinking about making changes to your nutrition. And that's something that a lot of people feel like the number of people, I worked with someone once who felt he clearly experienced weight stigma in his day-to-day life, and he would go to the gym at 1 a.m. every day to make sure that no one else was there watching him work out. That's like going to the gym at 1 a.m. And he would also have panic attacks going to the supermarket because he didn't know what to buy because he was so overwhelmed. Like, can you just imagine feeling like that? And there's us saying, track your macros, lose weight, go to the gym, like lift heavy. Like, that's so just impossible for some people to put into place. And we need to meet people where they're at and understand actually a little bit more about where people are coming from. And I think just, yeah, the fact that it's been so controversial, I think says a lot about the industry itself and our attitude to dealing with perspectives that are different to our own. And just simply like hearing, oh, you don't actually have to focus on calories, you can just focus on health. Why is that controversial? That may not be a perspective that you've considered before, but that should just make you stop and think and be like, oh, okay, this is a new approach. Is there any validity to this? Let me understand it a little bit more before I form an opinion on it for a start. And then when you do look a little bit deeper, as you say, it's like, oh, actually, this seems to be pretty helpful. There's not a lot in here that I would tend to disagree with. And it becomes, the more you understand, it probably is less controversial and actually can be very helpful. As you mentioned, even for people who, again, they make the point that appearance, weight, and health, they're all different things. And we can't judge someone's health or someone's kind of responsibility that they've taken for their health through simply how they look. There are people who look healthy, who would be a normal quote unquote BMI. They may be totally unhealthy, living off takeaway, just not eating that much. Like you can't see, they may not be exercising, but they just look like a normal weight. You can't tell what someone's doing just by simply looking at them. And in a similar vein, you can't judge someone for being a certain body weight when you know nothing about them. And especially when we know from a social economical standpoint that it has little to do with personal responsibility. And I really hate that rhetoric because it just shines like misunderstanding. And yeah, so I think there's a lot to be learned from different perspectives at the end of the day, and there's a lot that we can change about our approach, such as by emphasizing health. And even if you are working with someone who wants to focus on a fat loss goal, that doesn't mean that you can't emphasize the health benefits either, and that's probably a more sustainable approach long term.
Yeah, like I always think again with this whole framework, like I definitely know people that do, we'll say, like we'll call it IIFYM, like they're just like if it fits your macros, and they eat a terrible diet. They don't engage in, like, we'll say, healthy lifestyle practices in terms of like their stress management is not right, and their sleep is all over the place. Like there's no consistent regular schedule with that kind of stuff. And ultimately, like, they've eaten 3 vegetables in the last month, right? But they're like, oh, well, I hit my macros every single day, so I got this body composition change, right? Like, you wouldn't call that individual healthy. Like, yes, they might actually be metabolically healthy, right? In terms of, they're like, oh, well, like your blood glucose control is, phenomenal. It's great, But if you actually like look under the hood, you're like, oh, you've actually these, micronutrient deficiencies, you're overly stressed, like any number of health issues can be cropping up, and you just look at them, you're like, but I have a 6-pack, it's like, that's not, that's like, like you said, you can't see health. Like, yes, obviously you can see it to some extent. Like if you see someone that's like looks sick or whatever, it's like, oh, obviously, like you can see to some extent, like we did evolve to be able to see that kind of stuff. But it's not like, oh, this person has 12% body fat and this person has 20% body fat. That's, an indication of health. It's not like ill health increases your body fatness, like that's not the case. In actuality, like it's actually usually the opposite in terms of like if you get sick, like you tend to lose body fat, you tend to lose weight overall. And so like it's really hard initially. Like again, you get this visceral reaction where you just think of like, again, I'm just using these like terms, but like fat people that are just, oh, I just want to overeat and I don't care, like I just want to pretend that I'm healthy, and that's not the message that actual HAES aligned people are putting out, So I do think it requires a bit more, reading, or at least, listening to podcasts like this, or, videos. Like you put out great information. So like, obviously I'm going to give you details in the box below, the description box below, and like people should follow you and, do all that kind of stuff. But, just following people that actually put out good messages, not just some influencer who's just like, you know what, I'm actually just tired of, trying to look after my nutrition. So I'm just going to use this veil of like body positivity and say that I'm HAES aligned and do nothing for my health. I'm out on the piss fucking 12 days a week. Like, it's like this is not actually HAES aligned. And that's not to say that, like, obviously you can't, enjoy your life as well as, engaging in healthful, practices. But I'm just saying, it's like a lot of the time you see on social media, these are not actually HAES aligned ideas. So to really like help people understand the HAES concept, and I think this is beneficial for both people that are like, let's say, training themselves, coaching themselves, and then also coaches. How would someone who is focusing more on like HAES principles approach someone that has come to them for coaching or whatever? Like obviously, again, like there's helpful practices that you probably want to engage in across the board, whether you're fit, healthy, you want to lose weight, you want to do whatever, and like obviously if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you've heard them all before. Like they're pretty like core tenets and whatever. But how would someone who is like we'll say HAES aligned, that's how you coach people, how do you start the process with someone, and then how do you continue that process in terms of like, do we take them from a point, like obviously again it's going to be different for every single individual. I'm not expecting you to be like, this is the exact approach we take with every single individual. Like, it's going to be different, right? But how do you approach coaching someone and actually being HAES aligned? Like what does that process look like?
Yeah, well, I think we can all incorporate a lot of those HAES principles into the way that we coach people, just simply by focusing on the process and emphasizing health. And the reason that I make the point to keep saying like emphasizing health is that a lot of our clients will come to us with the goal of changing their body composition, which is totally fine. Like, it's really understandable why people feel like changing their appearance will make them feel better about themselves. Like, you can understand that given the media environment and all the rest of it. So what we can do is understand where someone's coming from, but really emphasize the improvements that they're making to their health, or the strength that they're building, things like that, in order to kind of shift the focus, not to discount their goals, but just to shift it to a broader perspective on health. And the thing is, if you're making a change because you want to look better, but also it's going to improve your health, but also you might feel more confident, but also you might sleep better, you might have better focus at work, all of this is just more reasons to make a change. And it's more sustainable long term, because the research does indicate that our motivations for making a change are very important. So if we're doing it for reasons such as like external validation, or purely to change how you look, then that's likely to increase your risk for developing pathological eating behaviors, for a start, which is something that we want to avoid and something we want to protect our clients against. But also it doesn't lead to long-term results. And if we can focus on health outcomes, they're going to be more sustainable. So what we can do when, for example, measuring a client's progress, is setting goals that are aligned to someone's values, because those values may be something like, I value self-care, self-respect, doing the things that I promised myself that I would do. And you don't have to wait for a goal to have happened, like a weight loss amount, I've lost 5 kilos, now I can be successful and feel good about my progress. Like, if you're acting in alignment with your values, that could be simply, having one nutrient dense meal, going for a walk. All of these things are aligned with that value of self-care, and you can celebrate your wins and your successes every time you engage in those behaviors. And then we can also, when someone feels like maybe they've lapsed on a behavior, they've slipped back into old habits, we can still point to all of the other actions that they did that were aligned with their values. So it's a very good way to help manage expectations as well, along with the dieting process. And I think just focusing on celebrating wins that are outside of simply just, oh, you lost X amount of kilos this week, well done, do it again next week. Like, I think if we can broaden our clients' own understanding of what success really is, then we're going to be setting them up for long-term success, but also a better chance at actually maintaining that weight loss. And one thing that I'll add is that when it comes to weight loss, people with overweight and obesity will see dramatic changes, like significant changes to their health with small amounts of weight loss as well. So like 5 to 10% of body weight loss leads to significant improvements in metabolic markers of health. And someone may not see that, and they may not feel successful if they've only lost a small amount of weight. So if we can really focus on the improvements that they're making to their health, then that's really what the important thing is at the end of the day, and they're going to feel more successful as a result. And I just think, yeah, if we can shift to that way of thinking, we don't have to discount aesthetic goals, but we're just actually giving the client more.
Yeah, like it's one of those things where, like, again, if you coach a lot of people, you start doing this automatically. You know, obviously, like if you're coaching like weight class athletes or potentially even like bodybuilders who are like, you know, they're trying to get into like the very far reaches, like it's like you're probably going to have to engage in unhealthy practices to get to 3% body fat, you know? So like if you discount those, if you're coaching the average person or, you know, the normal person, you automatically start coaching this way, you know, because like fat loss, it's not like it's predictable. Like obviously it is predictable to some extent, but it's not like, oh, you added exactly this calorie deficit and we can control all of the variables. So I know if you just do all of these things, you're going to lose 0.25 kilos this week. You know, like it's not like you can predict that. Like, yes, you can have a best guess and be like, if we engage in these habits, you know, we should see this outcome. But then you start realizing it's like, okay, the outcome is a little bit less important. Like obviously that's the goal for this individual. And obviously it is important, you know, there's a reason they're coming to you for it. And again, like you said, like you can dig deeper into that, you know, because people do have, let's say, misconceptions in terms of they're like, oh, I'll only be validated if I weigh 60 kilos on the scale or whatever it is, you know. Like obviously you need to dig deeper into that, but you start realizing it's the habits that are important, right? It's what you actually engage in day to day, week to week, that actually lead to the outcomes that you want, right? But also, and I think this is really important when you actually achieve your goal, right? So say you do lose all the weight that you wanted. You're like, oh, I wanted to be 60 kilos. I think I'll be, you know, magnificent then, right? Oh, that's exactly what people will love me then, right? And you get to that. Like if you haven't actually been focusing on the habits that, you know, led to that point, first of all, you may not actually understand how you got to that point, you know. So once you stop working with a coach or once you stop following a diet plan you found online or whatever it is, you don't actually understand the process that got you there. So it's far harder to actually maintain that. And, you know, it's all fair and well to be like, oh yeah, I want to reach 60 kilos once in my life, you know. That's not what most people want to do. They want to get the results and then sustain those results, or, you know, be within striking distance of those results. Like they're like, oh, 62, it won't be that big of a deal if I'm 62 kilos, you know. But if you haven't actually been focusing on the processes and like the habits, like you can not know how to maintain that. You can not know what actually you need to do to be in a good position at that 60 kilos. But also, if you haven't been focusing on, like, say, healthful habits along the way, like you can reach 60 kilos, but not actually be in a healthy position, as we've touched on. So, like, again, like outcome goals are obviously important and they do help people, you know, stay aligned with, you know, training, nutrition, and whatever else, even if they are arbitrary goals, like setting them for ourselves, like it can be beneficial for actually keeping you on track with things. For example, like you might be in the gym and you might be like, oh, I want to squat 140 kilos, you know, and that's keeping you aligned with, you know, going to the gym. You're like, oh, that's why I'm doing these training sessions. That's, you know, why I'm pushing myself here. Like that's the goal. And obviously that's an outcome goal, but you have to actually break that down into the habits that allow you to get to that outcome, you know? So even though the outcome is the goal, right? It is actually what's, you know, that's what's my guiding star or whatever you want to call it. Like that's what's pushing me forward. You still have to engage in the habits that lead you to that. Like, again, you can't just say, I want to squat 140 kilos and then never squat, you know? It's like, you still have to actually engage in the habits that lead to that outcome, you know? And I think even just using that kind of HAES framework and just kind of taking that weight neutral approach and just being like, right, there's healthy habits that we can engage in, right? Let's actually just focus on those healthy habits. And like I always try to, like, because obviously like I'm writing a lot of content and, you know, creating a lot of content for our coaches corner, and I'm thinking of like different frameworks in terms of how do you actually get a coach to coach someone, we'll say, correctly. And what I've been doing is just like giving like different options in terms of, you know, you could start here, this would be the ideal, this would be like probably, you know, what you're going to have to do. And this would be like, you know, the client is like, no, we need to do this, you know. So I'm giving options. But one of the things that I always kind of come back to, I'm like, the ideal would to be able to spend some time with this client in terms of, or like again, like yourself, and just not focus on the actual outcome, right? Spend a month, 2 months even, right? Or even longer. It depends on the actual, you know, client and the person, you know. But spend some time, and all you're focusing on is, okay, we just want to get training in a good position. You just want to be able to, you know, push yourself in training. We've, you know, exercise technique is all good. Like, we're not actually really focusing on the weight that you're using. We're not doing any of that. It's just, we just want to have training in a good position. Performance is good. But we also need to engage in these, you know, lifestyle habits. We want to get some, you know, steps and activity throughout the day. We want to do some sort of stress management. We want to do some sort of, you know, something around sleep so that we're getting sleep in a good position, right? Then the diet, it's like, we just want to actually start engaging in these healthy diet practices, like eat your fruit and veg, you know, like eat some protein at these meals. Eat, you know, again, like it's hard to assign calories without then focusing on like how the weight is changing. But you want to eat a calorie appropriate diet where it's like, I feel energetic throughout the day. I'm not feeling overly hungry. I'm not feeling like I need to be like binge eating, or, you know, I'm restricted in my calories or anything like that. And like, if you could spend a month, 2 months of just doing that and just really hammering home like the good habits and practices that lead to results long term, like the person is set up to do whatever they want to do. You know, like if you genuinely spend, we'll say 8 weeks, you're just like, right, I do my training programs, and they're 4 week blocks, right? So 4 weeks and 4 weeks, right? So it's 8 weeks in total. And you're like, if we just spent those 8 weeks and really just focused on nailing all the habits that eventually lead to good outcomes, like that person is in such a good position to get results for life, you know? And ultimately, like as coaches and as individuals who are coaching themselves, like you want to be in a position where for sure you can push hard for 8 weeks, 16 weeks, 20 weeks, whatever it is, and, you know, achieve a certain goal. Like you have a holiday coming up and you're like, I want to be lean for this holiday. But that's all on the backbone of having good practices and good habits in place. So the vast majority have never actually spent time just focusing on those habits for a while, right? And I think this is also where a little bit of the controversy comes in, and in terms of looking at the HAES principles. People, they have a toolbox, but the toolbox has never actually encompassed, you know, spending some time being weight neutral and just looking at, like, we'll say habit-based change. Like, even though habit-based change isn't just like a HAES principle, but I think it's very much aligned in terms of how people approach like HAES principles, or the framework, where it's like there's healthy habits. You know, you can engage in these healthy, objectively healthy habits regardless of your goals, regardless of, you know, your body weight, your body size, whatever. And doing that is objectively good for your health overall. And if you can nail those habits, then you can move on to, okay, now we're actually going to push a little bit for fat loss. You know, you're really in a good place with nutrition. You're really in a good place with your lifestyle. You're really in a good place with your training and whatever else, your stress management, etc. And now it's like, okay, yeah, you said you wanted to have a goal. We've dug a little bit deeper, and you feel that if you were actually able to see some meaningful weight loss on the scale, you would be happier. Like, if that's your goal and you think that that's, you know, something that you're like, that's going to actually help me overall, you know, happy days. We can push for that for a few weeks, see how we get on, and we can show you that this is possible. That builds confidence with the client. They're like, okay, so now I actually understand that, you know, it's all built on this framework of just these healthy habits. And once I engage with them, and, you know, maybe I modify my calorie expenditure a little bit, I actually do have control over my body. Because ultimately, like, if you are coaching someone, you're trying to build confidence in them, and you're trying to give them a skill for life, you know. And I don't think just dieting someone down, you know, even without a meal plan, like a meal plan is probably the worst in terms of this. Like, it's just like, here's a fixed set of things. But even if you're like, okay, we're going to coach you through your calories and macros and whatever, and you diet them down to a position where, you know, again, they get that 50 kilos, 60 kilos, 70 kilos, whatever it is, and then you're just like, right, we're done. Like, that's not a beneficial strategy long term. Like, you haven't actually empowered that client, and you haven't actually given them like a skill for life. Like, yeah, okay, we can say calorie tracking is a skill for life, because, like, again, once you know what you're doing, you can pretty much, you know, assess any kind of food. However, like, they don't have the healthful practices down. They don't have that habit or the habits that lead to success. And while yet they got to their 60 kilos, they're not actually in a position long term to, you know, be healthy. Even if they're like, oh yeah, like I lost the the body fat that I thought was going to be, you know, life changing when I lost it. You know what I mean?
I think there's a few things there. Like, I think increasing self-efficacy is huge, but also increasing self-awareness.
Mm.
So, for example, when starting with someone, and as you mentioned, like ticking off all these habits that we think would be beneficial for someone to start engaging in, it's also about understanding why they are acting the way that they are currently acting to. So, yes, you can identify, like, oh, here's a way that we can improve all of this. I noticed that you're not eating vegetables. I noticed that you're not sleeping enough. Like, we can identify all those changes that should be made from a health perspective. But it's also about thinking, what does the client feel like the best place for them to start would be? Like, oh, you know, the reason that I don't exercise is because I don't feel comfortable going to the gym, for example, or the reason that I stay up late is because I'm working 2 jobs to look after my kids, and it's very difficult for me. It's also difficult for me to cook and prepare meals because I'm always on the go. Like, it's about understanding why someone is acting the way that they are in the first place, and then talking to them with kind of coming together to form a plan about the things that they can change first. Like, at the moment, there's nothing, like from a client's perspective, they may believe that at the moment there's nothing I can do about my sleep, but I could, for example, rather than ordering breakfast out, I reckon I could make myself a protein shake. Even if I'm not ready to cook yet, that's something that I can do right now because it's the easiest place. It's going to have one of the biggest terms of like results in terms of like lowest hanging fruit, you know, biggest bang for your buck type thing. So I think that would be one thing, is to really understand where they're at and why they're doing that in the first place. Because for the most part, a lot of these behaviors, although they're not ideal or adaptive from a health perspective, they are probably serving some function. As I say, if you've got the type of person who is running between jobs and has a family to look after, getting a takeaway is serving the function in that it may keep the kids happy, you know. So you've got to understand why they're doing the things that they're doing, and then find other ways to help, you know, what could we substitute that for? Something that you're capable, you have the capacity to do, but it also serves a similar function in that, you know, it keeps the kids happy, or whatever it is, or you don't have a lot of time, that's fine, we can, you know, perhaps we can try something like this. But it's really important to let the client talk as well, and to let them kind of just to shine a light on their behaviors and their own understanding of why they act the way they do, but also their capacity for change. Because it's all well and good saying, oh, we need to change this, do this, this habit would be great for you. But if they don't feel capable of doing that, then it's not necessarily going to change. And so with that as well, with self-efficacy, that increases over time, and you can start by like small successes snowball into bigger results. So if we can start with the things that someone feels comfortable changing, that are hopefully going to be the lowest hanging fruit and get a lot of bang for their buck, they can then build their confidence. They'll see results in terms of, oh, I'm sleeping better now that I've got these habits in place. You know, as I say, I've got more focus, I just feel better day to day, my clothes are fitting much nicer now. Like, those are the types of things that are going to build that confidence and increase someone's capacity to change. So then, like you say, further down the line, they may be like, you know what, like, I feel like I've come a long way. I'm actually ready to learn a little bit more about my nutrition, and I would actually quite like to track my macros. Like, that's something that a client may come to you with, and then you can work with that. So I think just always starting from letting the client decide themselves what they would like to do with your guidance, but ultimately they're the ones that know the most about themselves and their own lives. And I think we can play a role in bringing that self-awareness up and building that self-efficacy. But I think we need to shift from just simply identifying areas to change and telling people what to do, to like collaborating with them to actually achieve that change.
Yeah, and like it is harder to coach like this, right? And like that, you should obviously say that, because obviously, like, again, like, people coach a certain way because, first of all, that's the way they've always coached or been coached or whatever. It's like, here's your macros, see you later. And like, that's not even a bad approach, because like that does actually teach you stuff. If it's just like, here's your macros, see you later, and then we start coaching like habits. Like, I sometimes like that, depending on where the client is at. If I'm like, all right, I actually think like I'm going to throw you in the deep end here, right? In terms of like, here's your calories and macros. I want you to try hit them. And then we start looking at, okay, so you made these wins, this was perfect, and this is how we need to change here, here, and here. But like you said, like it needs to be collaborative in terms of, it's not just always me saying like, you need to change this, or you need to change this, or you need to change this. It's supposed to be a conversation. It's supposed to be coaching, but that is, again, like harder to actually do, because you actually have to talk and listen to individuals. That is something that is hard, even though it's like that's the actual job description. It's like, this is coaching, like it's supposed to be collaborative, and it's supposed to involve communication. But again, it is harder to do than just saying like, all right, you didn't make your weight loss goal this week, so we're going to drop calories by 100. It's like that's easy. That's easy to do in terms of, it's like, all right, just tweak your calories and we're good to go. But that doesn't actually help the individual, and it's probably not a good thing, first of all, psychologically, but it's also not like understanding the physiology of the situation. Like, especially if you've a female client, where it's like, your menstrual cycle is going to affect your weight throughout the month. And if you're just like, oh, my only thing is like seeing the scales go down, and if it's not going down, like I have to change calories. Like, if you don't understand that there is this normal fluctuation, it's like your approach is always going to fuck these people up, So like, there is that. The next thing I just want to touch on, because we've obviously touched on it a lot, and I want to make sure that it is actually covered. And we did obviously have touched on it just a little bit. And to give a name to it is the intuitive eating like paradigm, which seems to go very hand in hand with like HAES. Even though, as I've said to you before the podcast, like, first of all, intuitive eating is a terrible name, right? Because intuition can just be wrong, like just flat out wrong, right? But also, like, bodybuilders or whatever, also have a term for like eating intuitively, intuitive eating, and those two things are not the same. But again, when you come to this, if you come to this from a bodybuilding realm or whatever, you can be left thinking like, they're talking about intuitive eating and I'm talking about intuitive eating, they must be the same thing. And you never actually dig a little bit deeper into what intuitive eating is. And like, you've kind of touched on the approach to intuitive eating to a little bit there. But like, bodybuilders or people in the health and fitness industry, because again, like, they're overwhelming, especially if you get your health and fitness information from social media, which, like, we've talked in the podcast before, how that is a terrible approach to get your health and fitness information. But if you get it all from social media, like, sex sells effectively. So like, these people that have these great bodies and they're shredded and whatever, they're fitness competitors or fitness models or whatever it is, like that's an easier sell on a visual medium in terms of like Instagram and stuff. So like, their message gets hyped up, or it gets louder than other messages. And again, you can be left thinking like, oh, intuitive eating is this like bodybuilding concept of intuitive eating, rather than like we'll say the HAES concept of intuitive eating. So if you could just kind of talk to that in terms of what is intuitive eating in a HAES aligned manner.
Yeah, so intuitive eating is not the same as eating intuitively. So as you mentioned, you get a lot of people from the fitness industry talking about intuitive eating, but actually they just mean not tracking macros, which isn't the same as intuitive eating TM, because what intuitive eating is, it's actually a self-care framework designed to break the cycle of chronic dieting. So there are a lot of people who have tried a number of fad diets in the past, not had great success, kind of probably yo-yoed back and forth on weight. They've developed a lot of rigid food rules. Like, you'll still find people that think that they can't eat carbohydrates, for example. Like, that's actually still pretty common. I think we get stuck in our echo chambers and we forget that, what kind of culture people are exposed to. And intuitive eating, TM, also isn't just about eating. As I mentioned, it's there's 10 different kind of steps to the whole process. It's an entire self-care framework. It incorporates, say, mindful movement as well. And it's similarly to HAES, it is a weight neutral approach. And what you may find is that an approach like that is exactly what someone needs. Like, a lot of people need to actually just take the focus off of dieting for a start. And if they've been restricting themselves from foods that they really want to eat, and they've struggled to give themselves unconditional permission to eat those foods, then that restriction often leads to overeating. It's kind of that paradox of dieting, is that you restrain yourself Or you may even be engaging in dietary restraint in the cognitive sense of the word, but you're not actually restricting your calories because, you know, it's just a misunderstanding there. And that breeds pathological behaviors as well, because if you're restricting yourself, you've given yourself all these food rules, you can't eat certain things, you may limit yourself in social situations, and then you may blow out at the end of the day because you feel so restricted. Like, the one of the best ways to overcome that is to actually take the focus off of dieting for a start. And I think that's something, again, that we fail to consider, is why someone is doing these behaviors in the first place. And simply sticking a meal plan on top of a poor relationship with food, like, doesn't really help. And it's, as I mentioned, it's not just about food. It's what we fail to think about is how someone's eating behaviors often reflects their attitude towards themselves. So if we can shift the focus from dieting, fat loss, appearance to a more health oriented approach where actually just allow yourself to enjoy your food for a little bit. I think a lot of people think that if they allow themselves to eat the types of foods that they like, that they're just going to blow out and overindulge and it's just pink donuts all day long. You know, that's not actually what intuitive eating is about. The 10th principle of intuitive eating is gentle nutrition, and it's actually about giving your body the types of foods that make you feel good, because everyone knows that if you've overindulged for a while, maybe like towards the end of a holiday, for example, you actually feel a bit crap and you just kind of want vegetables, you know, at the end of the day. And that's something that is very hard to come around to. I find that people struggle to give themselves unconditional permission to eat because they don't trust themselves to not go overboard. The analogy I like to use is that when you go grocery shopping, you have unconditional permission to buy whatever's on offer, but you don't go in there and be like, I'll have one of that, I'll have one of that, and you don't buy out the whole grocery store. You go in and you buy what you need, and you might pick a few things that you want as well, you know? And if you were going over your budget week after week, you would probably reassess and be like, oh, okay, I think this is going to be problematic. But you always have permission to buy whatever's there. And just because you have that permission doesn't mean you're going to have everything. And I think it works similarly from a food perspective, but it's very difficult to give yourself that permission if you're trying to control your weight because you don't want to gain fat. You're scared that, you know, if you ate whatever you wanted, you would gain fat. And I think we tend to use the intuitive eating terminology because it's intuitive to talk about, you know, not tracking macros as intuitive eating. They're just completely different things. And I think if we could understand that, it's problematic in the sense that it undermines the intuitive eating approach because nobody knows what it means and nobody understands the different principles or when or who it could be appropriate for. And the literature does suggest that intuitive eating is one of the most like psychologically sound ways of eating. So with flexible restraint and rigid restraint, there's actually quite a lot of correlation between the two constructs. They overlap by about 50%, and we're not clear what aspects of flexible control are distinct from rigid control. So we may think that we're promoting flexible and adaptive behaviors by helping our clients to track their macros because, yeah, you can fit in a little bit of what you want. That's not always the case. And I think if we can look a little bit closer into the nuance of dietary restraint, the psychological side of dieting, and what that can actually do to a person, and again, look to the other side as well, what's the benefits of this intuitive eating approach and how do I actually put it into practice? The closer we look, the better understanding that we get. And if we're just talking about, oh, you know, eating intuitively, listening to your body, like that's not what it means, you know, and we're not going to get better at helping the types of people that would benefit from that approach if we never actually look to understand it in the first place.
Yeah, like I think this is actually a huge issue in terms of the disconnect between like a lot of what people are exposed to, but also a lot of what people actually believe. Like again, like their idea of intuitive eating is like, oh, I'm just going to maybe start listening to my hunger signals a little bit more, right? And you're like, that's like, yeah, I can understand why you think that's intuitive eating, and that's what, you know, a lot of people refer to as intuitive eating. It's like, oh, I'm not going to track my calories, and I'm just going to listen to my hunger signals a bit more. And like, yeah, obviously that is a part of being more body aware in terms of listening to the hunger signals that your body is giving you, energy levels, all that kind of stuff, right? And they're all like objectively good things to engage in. You're like, okay, are you hungry or are you not hungry? How did that meal fill you up? How did that meal not fill you up? Great, that's all great. Again, maybe a bit like you said, fitting some, naughty food into your diet, and you're like, oh yeah, like I can actually do this and still get results. Like, again, you're like, okay, that's potentially a good beneficial, thing to help people learn. But I think the reason that people, especially if they come from like the health and fitness industry, they have an issue with the intuitive eating, like TM, because what they think of intuitive eating and what intuitive eating in this context are two different things. But also, they do realize that they actually have spent potentially years overriding all of the signals and all of the body awareness that would actually be required for, intuitive eating TM. To be effective. Like, for example, like I personally, like I like tracking my calories. I'm very like, as I said to you before the podcast, I'm very like consistency. I like having things very rigid. That's just who I am. Like Gary will tell you, like I have things planned out for our business like 5 years into the future, like I'm very much like make a plan, stick to a plan. Like even when Gary's late for a podcast or something, I'm like, that it ruins my plan. But like I like that. And like I like tracking my calories. I like engaging in those habits, right? But I know a lot of people do that and then try to go to a more intuitive approach, but they're not actually able to because they're just so much, there's so much in the thought process that I just hit the calories that are, dictated by my app. If I'm not hungry, but, I need to get the calories in, right? Like I know me personally, because I have spent so many years doing that, there was a point where I wasn't actually able to like listen to what my body was telling me, and like it's hard because like I do like, well, I did until Dublin was locked down again, but that's another story. I did like I went to the gym and I went to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So like my hunger signals could be all over the place based on what I was actually doing that day or what I was doing the day before, right? And this is also very true, especially if people engage in like intermittent fasting practices, where they start getting more used to like these bigger meals, and it's like, oh, like I actually like huge meals, that's all that I need to like fill me up, right? So like there's all these practices that go on in we'll say the macro tracking sphere, and that tends to be the fitness sphere, that actually make it harder in terms of like the psychology of dieting for a normal person, right? Because not everyone needs to track their calories, not everyone needs to track their macros. And I always think, I'm like, if your entire framework and your entire toolbox is just calorie tracking and macros, how are you going to teach kids to eat, right? Because that's what my framework is always. I'm like, all right, I need to know how to eat because like I'm gonna have kids someday, hopefully, and I want to have lots of kids. Like everyone in my family has lots of kids, so I want to have lots of kids. So how am I actually going to teach them to eat for a lifetime? Like, and if all I can offer them is like, here's an app, right? If this app gets deleted or this business goes out of service or whatever, you're on your own, right? Like that's not a great approach to nutrition. Or like I often go on like hikes and stuff, and like I'm planning a hike for like 2 weeks, and hopefully again coronavirus willing, for like 2 weeks. And if all my framework, like there's not going to be internet or anything, like if all my framework is like, oh, it's just calorie tracking, like if I don't know how to eat and how to listen to my body and understand nutrition, yeah, again, calorie tracking, macro tracking can be part of that. Like I'm not going to know how to eat on that 2 week, hike, and again, like that's in my mind, I'm like, your toolbox is empty. You've got one tool, right? So I understand why, like, again, if all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like, I understand why people have these approaches, because it's like, that's all I've ever been exposed to. That's how I diet. That's how I get these results, whatever. But you need to have a bigger toolbox because, again, like I said, you're going to need to teach your kids to eat someday. And even if you don't have kids personally, it's like you're still going to interact with children. Like you're still passing on the torch to other people, through the message that you put out on like social media, the messages you put out in like the written word, spoken word, whatever. Like you're still interacting, you're effectively still passing on that torch. So you want to actually be able to help more people. Like that's why a lot of people get into the health and fitness industry, because they want to help people. So having more tools in your toolbox, and again, calories and macro tracking can still be a huge part of your toolbox. They can be your bread and butter, but you still have all these other tools, and you also understand how to use these other tools so that you can actually use the calorie and macro tracking better. And I think, again, if people actually just read a little bit more in terms of the intuitive eating TM, like they get a better toolbox, you know?
Mm. Yeah, that's the whole point. It's like it's not about saying one thing's better than the other. It's actually about expanding your skills as a coach. And something that really baffles me is I don't understand why macro tracking is always our default, because for a lot of people, it's not actually appropriate, nor is it necessary. And from a client's perspective, if you're giving them things to do that, like when it comes to say macro tracking, if they simply just need to be in a calorie deficit, like you don't necessarily have to track your macros, and there are ways to educate people on, you know, their dietary choices without macros. There are other ways to do this, and if you're complicating the process unnecessarily for no additional benefit, why? That's not ideal from a client's perspective. And if they can get the same results from an approach that may be less intrusive and less potentially problematic, because there are risks involved. It's definitely not you know, it's not going to lead to eating disorders in everyone or anything like that, but there are some risks involved. So if we can understand the risks, understand the applications and who and when it's appropriate for, and also have other ways of doing things, because that is something that you hear a lot. Oh, well, macro tracking is a great way to hold yourself accountable. You know, you can really understand your nutrition. It's like, yeah, but there are also other ways to do that, ways that could be easier to put into practice, more sustainable. So why not look there as well? Or even just like not having a default. It's like, oh, but I've got my spreadsheets that I want to use for this client. It's like, your client doesn't care about these spreadsheets. And I think actually shifting away from always looking at quantitative data and actually just talking to your clients. Like, how do I know if my client's getting results if I can't see their macro? How do I like know if they're sticking to the plan? We'll talk to them, like to actually discuss their progress with them. So I think that's probably another downside of only having that in your toolbox, is that you're actually, I think when you're defaulting to an approach, you're not actually considering what's most appropriate. Because it's like, oh, well, I'm going to do this because this is what I do with everyone else. And it's also easy for me to track your progress that way. It's like, yeah, but this isn't for you, it's for your client. So we need to consider other approaches too. And I think that's one thing as well, is that unfortunately, when these approaches get misconstrued, it's very annoying because it muddies the waters. Because there's not going to be one single approach that's appropriate for everyone, and you know, these concepts aren't going to, like, some people can track their macros and be absolutely fine. Some people would benefit from an intuitive eating approach. So we need to get clarity on these concepts so that we can actually determine who they're appropriate for and when. It's not that we have to say one approach is better than the other. I do think there is fault on kind of both sides for that. Like if you read the intuitive eating book, they've recently updated it, and I haven't read that one, so I'm referring to like the first edition here. But they do misconstrue some of the research on dieting. Like they use the starvation experiment as an example, and as how, you know, detrimental dieting is for you. And I'm like, well, that's not really accurate. That's hardly representative of what happens in the real world. So there's like definitely fault on both sides. And I think I don't know why they do that. Like, your approach is valid. It doesn't have to apply to everyone in order to be valid. And actually, if we can just get really specific about what the benefits are and when these are appropriate, that's just going to be more helpful for everyone. So I think that's one thing that I would take away, is just to actually understand these approaches properly, understand who they apply to, and then broaden your own toolbox, and just you can kind of integrate a lot of these concepts when you're coaching people. Like, yes, we could do macros if you want, but let's also focus on health, you know, like they're not two separate things. So I think just understanding that and having a more well-rounded approach is going to allow you to work with more people. So is that not beneficial from a coach's standpoint as well? Like, people are going to get better results and you can help more people. So at the end of the day, that's probably what you want.
Yeah, and like I understand, like you were saying, like it's very easy to get sucked into like, oh, here's my spreadsheet, or here's my calorie and macro tracker, or whatever. And also, like, part of the fault is actually discussing nutrition, because it's very hard to discuss nutrition without saying like calories and macros, you know. And it's like, oh, like you can't just be like, oh, you need to make better food choices, you know. Like that's also not a prescription in terms of like, what does that actually mean? Like, so like to discuss this stuff, like it makes sense where you're just like, right, we need to eat in a calorie deficit, you know? So again, once you start using those words, people think I'm going to have to track my calories and macros because that's how I eat in a calorie deficit. But again, it's like, this is not the extent of how you actually approach that. You know, like there's multiple ways to achieve the same goal in terms of, you know, the process we want to engage in is like, yeah, we want to get a calorie appropriate diet, right? But you can come to that from so many different, you know, ways. And again, as a coach, you can still have a preferred way. Like again, like as I said, like with a lot of clients, I like that kind of like throw them in the deep end, see what happens, and then we start really getting into the actual habits that they need to do to, you know, be successful. But that doesn't mean that that's the starting point for everyone, right? But that also doesn't mean that you have to throw that approach out. You know, like that can be your preferred approach that you then update with these other things that you've learned, and you've taken this from this approach and you've taken this from this approach, and you understand all these things. So even though you're still using the same tool, because you've had these, you know, you've had experience with these other tools, you're like, oh, so this is how I actually can do this job a little bit better. And oh, with this, you know, person, this tool is actually more appropriate and I can use that. And ultimately, I think like if you're actually trying to help people, you probably would cycle through a few different approaches. Right? Like again, like you were saying, like you could start off in more of a, we'll just say a habit-based change in terms of all we're going to do is weight neutral. We're just going to look to get better habits, better, you know, sleep, all that kind of stuff. And it's just, you're just engaging in better habits, right? But you can still eventually get them to a point where it's like, all right, we're actually going to track calories and macros and all that kind of stuff now for a little while, just so we can really dial in your nutrition, you know? But then maybe you go off that, or maybe again, like even if you're just purely calories focused, like you should still cycle through a few different goals with that so they understand the process with that, you know, where it's like, all right, here's the calorie deficit, here's calorie maintenance, here's like, you know, calorie surplus. So they understand the process that's involved in all of those different things. And again, a lot of people get caught up in the framework where it's like a calorie deficit. That's all I know. And the only way I know how to get that is calorie and macro tracking. So that's the only thing I'm going to do. And again, I always think it's one of the worst things that people do with getting people results. And that is like never actually taking them through periods of time where they're just eating at maintenance, you know, which is very HAES aligned in terms of it's like, right, you can eat at maintenance, you can still be tracking your calories, but all we're doing is focusing on healthful behaviors at maintenance. Because if you've never actually taught someone to maintain, like you haven't actually gotten them results, right? Like, yeah, I always think it's like throwing darts and something, throwing darts at a dartboard, and like, yes, you got a bullseye, but you have no way to consistently get that. Like, well, yeah, maybe you do. You're like, I throw a certain way, but it's not consistent, and like it's not a process. Like you don't have a system to it that you could, you know, potentially teach to others, because like you occasionally get the bullseye, but you never get it again, and you never actually maintain that result. Like it's like, it's not maintainable, it's not reproducible. And like, yeah, obviously it's reproducible to the extent that, you know, you can slap a calorie deficit on someone and they'll potentially lose weight, but it's not like, they're not going to have that for life. They're not going to be in a good position for the rest of their life, which, you know, again, I always think, how are you going to teach your kids this? How are you going to, you know, teach other people this, like longer term? Like, is that appropriate to just be like, all right, my only approach is a calorie deficit? Probably not. You know? So again, if your only approach is calories and macros, like, is that appropriate for everyone? Probably not. Like most people, even if you see them in like the health and fitness industry and you follow them, like they'll be tracking calories and macros, but in a few years time, they're like, I'm actually moving to that kind of, we'll say, bodybuilding, intuitive eating approach, where they're listening to their hunger signals. Yes. And, you know, they have this huge awareness of, you know, portion size and calories and macros and stuff, so that they are able to eat a calorie appropriate diet without actually actively tracking, you know? So even if you are looking at these people that you idolize and they are moving to a more intuitive approach, even though, like, again, there are differences, as we said, learning different approaches is probably going to help you in your long-term approach to your diet and all that kind of stuff, but also help the clients that you want to train or you want to, you know, coach or whatever. So why shy away from this stuff? Like, if you already know that the majority of these people that are, you know, really big like calorie and macro tracking proponents, and again, I think it's a very valuable tool, if they're already moving towards something that it's like, oh, well, there's life after tracking in terms of like, this is what we do, I'm like, why would you not learn habits and, you know, processes and systems before you have to eventually, you know, get onto that? And like, it just makes sense, you know?
That's exactly it, because otherwise you get clients who are very good at dieting and very good at tracking their macros. So like, you're probably going to want to spend over the course of your life the least amount of time dieting and macro tracking. Like, ultimately, for most people, the goal is to simply maintain with as little effort as possible. So if you can only ever diet and you can only ever macro track, that doesn't really set you up for long-term success. So I think definitely thinking about those things. And as you mentioned, you don't have to choose, you can do a bit of everything. And ideally, if you're working with someone, it's great to take them through a deficit, take them through maintenance, take them into a surplus. And throughout those stages, you can macro track, you can not macro track. So something that I take my clients through often is like non-tracking weeks, just to see where they're at with regulating their own intake and basically putting what you learn into practice. Because macro tracking, yeah, it's a great educational tool. So once it's served that purpose, you still need it. And if your goal is to maintain, for example, can't you maintain without tracking? Like, do you really need MyFitnessPal there to tell you that you're eating appropriate amounts? Like, especially when for, say, optimal results, like if you're talking, say, protein intake, for example, the literature gives us a range anyway. Like, it's not like you have to hit 2 grams on the dot and that's your ideal amount. It's like anywhere between this range is fine. And if you've got your habits in place and you're choosing protein at each meal, the likelihood is you're going to fall into that range anyway. So what benefit does tracking give you in that instance? And again, it's not like you have to choose, but just simply giving it a go is a good idea, because a lot of people get too attached. And I find that that's probably the most important thing, is that it's not any one approach that's wrong or right, but it's kind of the inability to adapt outside of that approach. So what happens when you don't track for a week? If you feel like you're going off plan, like, I think that's a red flag. If you're tracking because you're choosing to, great. If you're tracking to because it's an obligation, you don't know how to manage your diet without it, maybe that's something that should be addressed. And yeah, as a coach, you can definitely take someone through all of these stages, and then they've got every tool that they need to then manage their nutrition the way that they like. So it's not just like, oh, I can only do it if I track macros. It's like, no, I can choose to if I want. I could not track if I want. And you could do that at any stage. I have a client who tracks Monday to Thursday and then doesn't track over the weekend because that's what he likes to do. And we're in a fat loss phase right now and he's getting results. Like, it's just about understanding what someone wants. And I worked with someone recently actually who like had such great success. His goal was to move away from macro tracking. That he'd done it for years and he just wanted to be able to eat without stress and to lose a little bit of weight and then maintain. And that's exactly what he did. And it was like the easiest process ever. I felt like I barely coached him. He was like so grateful each week and so nice and like, oh, you know, I've noticed so many positive changes, blah, blah. And I said to him, like, I felt like I barely coached you. What do you think it was that kind of helped you so much when this was something that you'd struggled with for a long time? And he said that when we did the initial consultation, it was the fact that I just let him speak and I really understood what he wanted to achieve and where he was coming from. So when that came to putting a plan in place, it was a plan that was appropriate and it was easy for him to implement. And from my perspective, I was like, damn, I literally felt like I didn't have to do much, like a bit of guidance each week, but there was no like, kind of hurdles. And I think that says a lot. It's about understanding what the person wants and what kind of approach would suit them. And then it's going to be more likely to lead to success. And if you can do that with, you know, with kind of getting it right from the start, then again, better results for your client, better results for you as a coach, everyone's happy.
Right, so we could probably talk about stuff like this all day. Like, there's actually so much that we could actually get into. So rather than do that, we might actually just have you on the podcast again to talk about some other things that I'm already thinking of potentially talking about. But if people actually do want to learn more about this stuff, right? Now, obviously you put great stuff out on your Instagram. And again, that's going to be linked below. But other than that, like, where can people find more information about this stuff? It is actually something that, first of all, there's loads of websites that have this stuff. But again, you can find, like, they have a very like a SJW approach, or they can be like, oh, HAES is stupid. Intuitive eating TM is stupid. And it's like, all right, well, I just want like I basically just want a centrist approach, or a reading of this that tells me the good points of this, tells me the bad points of this and the good points, and like just give me the good points. That's all I want, you know. And so where can people find out more information? First of all, from you, like what have you got going on, and then also like is there anywhere that they like this is a good resource for people to go to?
Yeah, so a good place to kind of find me would be, as you say, over on Instagram is probably where I'm most active, and that's just at Shannon Beer _. But also, I would say to check out the Bridging the Gap work that Gabrielle and I have been working on, because that's exactly what it's about, and the comprehensive coaching framework. So we're actually midway through our first webinar series where we're teaching people about like both sides of the argument and what the literature actually shows. So what are the stats? What are the real success rates of dieting? Is it true that only like 5% of diets work or whatever? And we've looked into all of that, and we've come up with a framework that we think is kind of like what we would like to see the industry moving towards, like the types of skills that we think practitioners should have, like a knowledge base they should have, an understanding of behavioral psychology, understanding of body image, weight stigma, weight neutral and fat loss focused approaches. And also our approach to coaching, in the sense that, as we've touched on, like it's a collaborative approach that suits the client. So we've put out a lot of content, and some articles that would probably be a good place to start would be the Bridging the Gap article series, touching on like the dangers of dietary restraint, what weight neutral approaches actually are, and understanding the nuance there, and then the comprehensive coaching framework. So we have a website. I can give you just all of the details.
Yeah, you can just send them on. I'll link them.
Yeah. But that would, I think, would be a good place to start, because at the end of the day, I don't care what approach is the best approach. I just want to know when they apply and when I should use them. It's not like neither of us favor any sort of approach, and we're not trying to push anything either. It's like, here's the info, let's work with that and see what kind of results that we can get.
Yeah, and I think again, like if you're coaching yourself or you're coaching other people, like having more tools in your toolbox, it makes sense, right? Even if you never use the tool, right? You're just like, oh, that was very interesting information that I learned about, whatever topic or whatever. And you're like, I could potentially use that someday. Like you might never use it. Like I could tell you so many like little tidbits of information that I've learned about, I'm reading a clinical biochemistry book here, right? And I'm like, oh, that's a little sign that I could potentially use. Like I'll probably never use that stuff, right? However, I'm like, all right, that's actually just helping me become a better coach. Like obviously this is my job. I'm not saying that, you're just coaching yourself. You have to read like all these random books and whatever. But for most people, if you can just expose yourself to a few different opinions and not have, like I said at the start, like a visceral opinion, like, oh no, that has to be wrong because that goes against my worldview. If you can do that and take a more measured approach to your understanding of this stuff, a more measured approach to actually like listening to other people's discussions, opinions, arguments, like how did they arrive at that? Like, first of all, that's just good practice all over your life, like politics, whatever it is. But if you can do it, especially around nutrition, it does actually help you to be better in terms of how you get results, how you can help yourself, and then how, if you are a coach, like how you can help others. So I think, again, I know 20-year-old Patrick who was like authoritarian right, where it's like, like I'm not like it's straight arrow, law, logic, order, all that. Like I probably wouldn't have, I would have seen HAES and gone like, nah, look, that can't be right. Because again, that was me being stupid, blinkered, in terms of not actually reading in deeper into the approach. So if you are listening to this and you're kind of like, no, like that just goes against my worldview. Like it does behoove you to spend a little bit of time just listening to the arguments and actually reading the arguments and actually reading the thoughts. And you'll realize that, okay, you can have that kind of ordered, logical, like this is what the exact science says in terms of, we'll say, physiology. Like that's not what humans are. Like humans are a conglomerate of a load of different things in terms of, like, we'll just say easily, like it's like psychology and physiology. It's like we have to be able to bridge those two things. And okay, yes, the physiology might say this, but we have to take into account that the psychology of this individual, we can talk about psychology generally, but the psychology of this individual, we have to layer that on if we actually want to get this physiological result. Again, like we said repeatedly, it's like, all right, you want to get a calorie deficit, like that's a physiology thing. It's like, that's thermodynamics, but actually coaching that and actually getting someone to eat a calorie appropriate diet for that goal, it's like, it basically becomes down to psychology.
That's something that I like to make the point is you are not working with an energy balance equation. You're working with a person.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like, again, like you read more into it, again, you might have a visceral opinion at the start, but it just makes sense, and again, obviously there's people that are just hyperbolic to the extreme on one side or the other, and just don't listen to those people, but also
anything.
but like you listen to them, but be like, okay, cool, I'm just going to see how does that align with what I thought was going on, and be like, okay, no, you're actually not actually aligned with the thing you think you're aligned with, and you're also a little bit crazy, so maybe I'm not going to listen to your opinions in future. But again, like it's one of those things where it is what it is, and you just have to like take what is useful from different places and build your own practice. Again, if you're a coach, but also if you're an individual, like build out a system of dieting that allows you to get the results that you want, to be happy, to have a system that you would be comfortable teaching your kids. Like I know a lot of people, and like I know traditionally it's been left to women to basically raise the kids and teach them their eating habits and whatever, and like that's not taking or I should say, like women feel such a responsibility for that, and they can feel like they're like, oh well, like I don't want to teach my kids these we'll say unhealthful habits that I've picked up in terms of how I feel about my body or how I feel about my diet, or I don't want them to be binge eating. I don't want them to experience all of these things that you experienced. And I think as a whole, the health and fitness industry has not helped those people. Like they've not actually given them frameworks for actually, understanding nutrition. Yeah, like that's obviously beneficial, but actually understanding that intersection between like the nutrition and the psychology side of it, where it's like, there's so much that goes into this that actually makes a healthful diet. And if your approach is always just a calorie deficit, like you've kind of missed the point, But again, like we're going to get you on again to talk about some other stuff. I do want to get more opinions on the podcast about different things, because again, like myself and Gary, like we're not experts. Like I say it all the time, like I'm pretty stupid. Gary's definitely stupid. But so like we don't know all the answers, and like I'd rather people got good information than think I am some sort of oracle, where like that again, like you see like people listening to this, they're like, oh, this is Patrick and Gary's podcast, like you get like idolized or you get like put on a pedestal. I'm like, if you met me, like you'd be like, this guy is stupid, right? So like don't idolize people, but at the same time, people do have great information, so like talking to them, listening to podcasts like this really does help. So do you have any final things to say before I just hit you with the final question that I'm starting to ask a few more podcast guests? Do you have anything that you'd like to touch on before we ask you the question?
No, I feel like we did. Yeah, I think we've covered it pretty well. Just as we're saying, have more tools up your sleeve in your coaching toolbox, but also really consider the fact that you're actually working with a person who needs to understand their own behaviors and has their own preferences, and we need to accommodate that. And I think just taking more responsibility as a coach is something that we could all do to help shift that dynamic that the industry is kind of, that trap that we've all fallen into. I think just focusing on a health perspective is really beneficial for a number of people.
Right, so we're going to get you with the question. So what habit do you think more people should engage with to be healthier, to be happier, whatever, right? Just one habit. That's you're now on the spot, world peace. This is what we have to do. What's the habit?
To read widely, consider other perspectives, and be willing to suspend your beliefs and change your mind.
That's a very, very good habit to engage in. I definitely wouldn't. I would have said something stupid like, "Oh yeah, just increase your
Sleep,
your steps or something." I would have been like, "Oh, yeah." But yes, your habit is much better than mine. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. As I said, guys, like you'll find all the information in the description box, wherever it is, whatever podcasting app you're listening to this on, YouTube, whatever, it'll be below, or click on it or whatever. And all the information, all the links will be there. And as I said, like we probably most likely will have Shannon on again. So in future, like if you do have questions or anything, like you can join our Facebook group, you can join our email list, and you can email us. Like we're always contactable. And like Shannon, you're quite good on the old Instagram. So if people are interested, like they can get in touch. Again, we're not some esoteric, beings in the ether that you can't communicate with. Like we can be found. Like you can find us, you can communicate, you can put your thoughts forward, you can ask questions. If you have never been exposed to this stuff, like read some stuff about it, go on Shannon's profile and read some of the posts, get a better idea of what like the whole thing is, and hopefully you'll be in a better position after that.
Yeah, awesome.